Really, this game is pretty damn solid overall and was a real hit in 1993, appearing in several best of the SNES lists. But was there really anything that matched it play for play? The short answer is no, not in 1993. But there's an impressive list of similar but different alternatives that either came out after or around roughly the same time. So Star Fox was clearly popular and was quite groundbreaking tech-wise. So then what the heck happened here? I meant the Super FX chip was used by almost nobody. I think maybe all of 5 games used it. I know
the vast majority of them were made by Argonaut themselves.
Yeah, exactly. Now the Super FX Chew was Super FX Juice. That one was slightly different. Or that one had a few more games, some of which were 2D, as in the case of Yoshi's Island.
It actually had fewer games, really, because it had 4.
Oh yeah, so it had
3. Sorry, actually, it was 4. No, it was 3. It had 3 games, and that was Doom, Yoshi's Island, and then the European exclusive released a year after those 2 games, in '96, Winter Gold. That was it.
So yeah, not very many games used this, and even for a short while after Star Fox came out, 2D games continued to dominate the marketplace. It really wasn't until about 1995 that 3D graphics started to take off, and that actually coincides with the PlayStation's release. And then you had the bombshell that was Quake, released in 1996, but kind of raises the question of why exactly did this game not take off? Why didn't this spur a sort of 3D revolution in the industry? Was it the costs associated with it? Because they did actually have to manufacture a custom chip for this, so...
Thing is, it's really odd in the industry that 3D just never really seemed to get a foothold. There were 3D games here and there were 3D games in the arcade, but home systems, they were 2D, and generally it seemed like people wanted 2D games on their consoles. There were, there were a handful of 3D games before Star Fox on home consoles, and there were plenty of PC games where 3D was a little bit more popular, I'd say.
Yeah, I'd say the arcades a little bit. There was a few 3D games here and there. It seems to be mostly confined to the PC, and this is actually something we should probably discuss at some point, is whenever you talk about a game like Star Fox, there's always that idea of firsts in the industry. Clearly, Star Fox was not the first 3D game ever released. I mean, I think that honor goes to, was it iRobot?
Yeah, this is generally the honor is given to iRobot, and that's because it came out late 1983, 1984. I'm not quite sure if the exact release date is properly known, but it is definitely out by 84. Thing is, there is a second game that came out roughly the same time, but it was such a non-hit that it's almost completely forgotten, and that is Cube Quest. That runs on Laserdisc technology.
Now that one is really unusual because the basic gameplay, I would say, is closer to Tempest, but they have these amazing scrolling video backgrounds. And then there are even sections in the stage where you have to dodge obstacles. It's almost identical to Sector X and Star Fox. It's really weird, some of the parallels between Cube Quest and Star Fox. And the games are actually, I think Cube Quest predates Star Fox by what, a good decade?
Yeah, basically a decade.
So
it's basically, the design of it is essentially, it's kind of like Tempest, but with a trackball.
It actually uses a trackball? Huh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, it uses a trackball, and it has 3 buttons. 2 buttons for fire, and they both do the same thing. And a special button to rotate the cube, which, yeah, there's a cube. That's why it's called Cube Quest.
Actually, you know what? The map structure in Cube Quest is actually vaguely Star Foxian because well, what happens is, okay, so you're on this cube, this intergalactic space cube, and you start off on one corner of it, and you're supposed to slowly navigate to an endpoint, which is supposed to be some sort of treasure or something. And along the way, you can sometimes encounter, like, boss waves, I want to call them, essentially.
Well, it is more like a boss from Star Fox. You have to shoot your way through the boss and hit its core. I don't believe it actually influenced Star Fox, but this game has a lot of similarities, which you would be surprised to learn.
Yeah, it's just very strange, the comparisons there. Now, after that point, I think it took a little bit longer for 3D to sort of reappear. I mean, there are a number of games that had limited 3D. I mean, you have the Freescape 3D adventure games, which they were 3D, but I believe the way it was rendered was different than how games work nowadays. It only updated what you could see when you moved, rather than constantly, refreshing the screen or rendering the game. It's very difficult to explain because it doesn't work on frame rates exactly.
When you see it in motion, you can sort of go, oh, yeah, I get it. It looks different. It does make a tangible difference to how it plays, because they tend to move a lot slower.
Yeah, pretty much.
The thing about like iRobot and CubeQuest is they came out and nobody wanted to play them. Like, it's strange that you had a game that would have been technically impressive maybe 4 or 5 years later, and then you had nothing but 2D titles in the arcade until, I really want to say, like the 1990s. Like that, before that you just didn't have 3D games really.
There were a few. There's Steel Talons, which predates Star Fox, and that's another one to bring up, because that's the only 3D game on the NES, or excuse me, the only 3D game on the SNES that doesn't use the super effects. There's 2 games, I believe, in fact, for the SNES that are 3D and that don't make use of these super effects, and that's Faceball 2000 and Steel Talons. There might be another game, I just don't know what it is.
There's not many, because the way the processor worked on the SNES, it struggled to render polygons. And you can compare it to the Sega Genesis in this regard, which, due to the way the processor functioned, it was able to render more convincing 3D graphics. Not great 3D graphics, like it wasn't mind-blowing or anything, and it was choppy in general, but it could do it.
You brought up the Genesis. There's a number of actual full 3D games that predate Star Fox for the system. I mean, you have Star Cruiser, which was a Japanese-only release, I believe. That's like a weird first-person shooter. You have CyberCop, also known as Corporation, which was released on a number of other systems, notably Amiga and PC-DOS. That's more of a first-person shooter. You have hard driving. You have a number of sim games, I believe. I think F-22 was one of those.
Yeah.
You have LHX Attack Chopper, and then you also have the Steel Talons, as noted earlier.
And the Steel Talons, it's different to the SNES one in that the rendered helicopter is an actual 3D rendered object, whereas the SNES cheats with sprites. And also in the Genesis version, I believe the landscape actually barrels and moves as you putt around in your helicopter, whereas in the SNES it's a background graphic that just tilts using I expect mode 7 in the background rather than an actual flat poly ground.
Yeah, so it's obvious here that Star Fox wasn't the first 3D game, not even even the first 3D game on a console system, but I think it might be safe to say it was the first popular 3D game, because I'm not sure how well these other games sold. I would assume, average for the era, but I don't think they were smash hits like Star Fox was, because I don't remember hearing anything about them.
I think hard driving was somewhat popular with racing fans, because they're realism driven in some ways, so a 3D landscape is more interesting. Star Fox is leagues ahead of these games just because of the way the FX chip can render.
Yeah, there are actually a few games I would recommend to those who are actually curious about the history of 3D graphics, or really 3D graphics in console games or PC games or anything really. Notably, there's an Amiga title known as Aquaventura, excuse me. That one is very strangely similar to Star Fox, and particularly Star Fox 2, from what I understand. I've only seen a gameplay video of it. I haven't played it yet. Can you explain more about that one, Cal, or?
Well, in Aquaventura, this is from 1992, so it was slightly before Star Fox. You have to destroy a couple of objects in the landscape, and then I think you have to destroy a major target, and then you fly through tubes. And these tubes look, well, they're linear tubes that you fly through, and it's kind of Star Foxian in a way. There is kind of a genre of shooter that's like this, because I know that there's a couple of other games in that genre. I think Epic by Ocean Software, and that's kind of a similar game. I don't know, because there's quite a few like this, because even Star Glider by Argonaut is a game that's like this, right?
Yeah, I believe so. I think it's wireframe 3D, so it's closer to Battlezone, but it's still the same sort of game.
Yeah, conceptually the game's the same. Aquaventura uses, I think it uses mostly flat polys, so that's where it starts to look a lot more like Star Fox. So there were games that followed after Star Fox, something that not just Sega but other companies, I think they tried to capture some of the Star Fox market, because obviously it was only available on the SNES.
Yes, there are, on the Genesis I know of at least, or actually the Sega CD, there were a couple of games I think on the Sega CD that came out right after Star Fox. You have Soul Star, and then you have Starblade. Soulstar is actually pretty interesting because it does sort of what Star Fox does on the SNES, except it does it using sort of sprite scaling and rotation. Like all the graphics in the game are sprites, but it's clearly using the advantages of the Sega CD hardware to sort of render this Starfield or this, this sort of unique action-y 3D shmup sort of game.
I think it's a direct response to what Star Fox represented.
Very gorgeous game, some great classic Amiga-style pixel art on display in that game, and it was made by Core, who would later go on to make Tomb Raider, which is actually a pretty notable 3D game title. So,
and Project Eden, a game you didn't play.
We might do a post-mortem on that someday, though. So
that's a good idea. The other thing that you probably won't have been able to hear of because it didn't actually see release, there was a planned Psygnosis published game called Rescue, and the notable thing about this one is it almost has an identical bonus level to Star Fox. You look at it and it's basically they ripped Star Fox and put it as their bonus stage.
Yeah, there's actually there should be a beta floating around, and the game seems mostly complete. And shockingly enough, it has that weird little mini game, so it makes you wonder why exactly it makes you wonder, for starters, why it was confined to just a mini game, and two, why the game never saw release. But I'm sure there's any number of reasons for that. I think it was a late gen Genesis title when it was in development. It was probably canceled because really at that point, who was buying new Genesis games?
Obviously, Nintendo released Star Fox, and that was, I think it was a huge win for the SNES, just them getting that game out there. Sega couldn't really respond directly to the 3D in that game because it used special chips that no one else had access to. But Sega did decide that they had to get into that market. As I'm sure you're all aware, there's the Virtua series of games by Sega that were in arcades, Virtua Fighter, Virtua Cop, but most importantly, Virtua Racing, because this is something that's not brought up too often, but Sega actually developed their own special chip. I think is it the SV chip?
I think so, something like that.
And that chip they actually put into a cartridge to run Virtua Racing. And it's a really, really high quality port. You could pick it against the arcade version, but it's miles ahead of anything else on the Genesis. It's easily up there with the FX2 chip games in terms of how fast it runs. I don't think there's any slowdown in it. At least
it's a very
not nearly
smooth
as
playing.
Much.
Very impressive.
Yeah,
I remember renting that game and being blown away.
Yeah, Sega were planning all sorts of things for this, and they didn't end up doing anything with it. And I'm pretty sure that one came out in 1994, which actually means it was released alongside the FX Chip Racer Stunt Race FX, I think. I think it was released roughly the same time.
Yeah, around the same time.
And FX Stunt Race it's kind of cool. I really like it in terms of visuals, but it suffers from the same problem as Star Fox, where it does chug quite a bit in places, which is really the problem with, I think, most of the other FX Chip original release games. They chug in places. The system is not able to handle it. Okay, so out of the other FX Chip games, there was one called Vortex, which I found Vortex always was the most interesting FX Chip game outside of Star Fox.
It interested me the most because you play as a giant robot that can transform into other forms. That was a game I always wanted to play as a child. But Star Fox was cool, but there was just something about Vortex that appealed to me more. But
well, it was going to be a Transformers game, apparently, wasn't it? There's something going around about.
That's the rumor I was reading, yeah.
And that game's rather cool. So the thing is, they did actually plan a follow-up to Star Fox, which it made a lot of sense to do that, given that it was a 1993 release, and the N64 wouldn't come out until 1996, I want to say. So they had a few years to get out a new version of Star Fox, a critically acclaimed, highly popular game. And Argonaut and Nintendo did that immediately following Star Fox. They began work on the follow-up Star Fox 2, using the FX2 chip. And this game was going to be more similar to Star Glider, and they ended up canceling it, what you could describe as ready-to-release status, because they believed that the N64 was going to come out sooner and they didn't want to overshadow it, and that was directly from Nintendo HQ.
Yeah, Nintendo has a habit of pretty much cutting off support for the previous console as soon as they announce the next generation of hardware, which is it's kind of frustrating in an instance like this, because I've played this Star Fox 2 Proto and it's pretty impressive. It runs much smoother. it's got this huge like strategy map to it. Like I think there's traditional planet stages, but then like the space stages are all arenas. Actually, wait, I think even some of the I think even the planet stages are arenas
They're
as
all
well.
arenas.
Yeah. So there's free roaming. There's times when you actually transform, like your R-wings, the R-wings, and I say R-wings because there's different models of them now. They can transform like into walkers, and there's some really cool set pieces there. So it just blows my mind. You have this game that looks like a perfect follow-up to Star Fox, and it's just canceled, like right as it's about ready to be released, because they assumed, the N64 was right around the corner.
That's why I always felt that Star Fox 2 seems to be an extension more of Vortex than it does Star Fox.
Yeah, it does. It's not exactly, I wouldn't say it's a sequel to Vortex or a spiritual sequel to Vortex, but it does take some elements from that game, notably the transformation and the free roaming arena-esque stages. It's strange to me that the Super FX chip was so limited, or it was used so sparingly, given it sort of had an edge over things like the Sega CD and 32X, which both arguably performed a little bit better, at least in terms of games. There were way more games for both the Sega CD and the 32X, and even Nintendo's much later 3D system, the Virtual Boy. That also had a number of way more games than the Super FX did. So I'm not sure why they didn't capitalize on this, because they had essentially full 3D games without having to own any sort of attachment or without having to buy into a new system. And the only answer I have to that is maybe the N64, they were just prototyping it around that time or something, or they had an idea for it.
It's an interesting thing looking at the FX chip, because it's one of those things that gets brought up as a clear superiority between the SNES and the Genesis, because yes, the SNES had the 3D FX chip, and yes, it was very impressive. You just have to look at Star Fox or Vortex or the unreleased games, Star Fox 2, etc. It's a clear advantage, but it didn't ever really seem like they capitalized on it, or they couldn't, and the industry was hostile towards the 3D graphics.
Yeah, maybe it was just too much too soon, because outside of Star Fox, I don't think any of these SFX or, the Super FX games performed very well, except for maybe Stunt Racer FX. I think that one was mildly popular, because it's a racing game, It works pretty well with the 3D graphics.
Well, that was a neat game. There's some really cool levels in that.
Some really nice effects and usage, and a really nice usage of the chip in general.
The thing is, when they canceled Star Fox 2, at least for me, when I played the game, I don't think it would have been a hit. This game feels like if it had to come out, which I assume it would have come out in 1995, I just can't see it being that popular. Every other 3D game had sort of misfired at this point. I think there was a lot of enthusiasm for the upcoming next generation of consoles, so it doesn't surprise me that Nintendo pulled the plug on it. Even if it has the Lynx, I don't know what her name is, but she's really cool, and I'm annoyed that they sort of removed the interesting characters that they made up for this game in return for some just arbitrary characters they threw into Star Fox 64. Well, I think it's fair to say that Star Fox for the SNES was, if not entirely unique, was unique due to the sum of its parts. It was an interesting little game, and despite what you might think, as far as my sources have been able to indicate, it looks like this game sold for the normal US dollar price of about $60 US, so maybe that's, more than anything else, helped its popularity. It didn't cost extra, and I think Nintendo in this instance just swallowed the cost of the extra chip to help get it on the shelves, and at least in that regard, I think it helped boost its popularity significantly. So with that in mind, we're going to wrap up the scores here. At the Postmortem, we give out 2 scores. A contemporary score, which is a comparison to other games and sort of knowledge at the time, along with a modern score, which is a score that we put out. It's much more arbitrary, but it's if the game was released today, how do we think it would fare? And we generally try and play down the graphics a little bit, but I don't know if we can do that in this case, because this one has a kind of unique graphic style, which is not just a retro throwback as such. Snabu, I'll get you to go first.
When this game came out, it was a huge technical marvel. There's not a lot on console systems that really compare, so I would say 9 out of 10, because it does have some issues that would have been evident at the time, obviously. They probably wouldn't have cared so much about the frame rate, maybe the collision detection, some other things, the little bit of a difficulty curve there is on trying to pick the game up for the first time. If I had to rate it yesterday, 8 out of 10. it still holds up in a lot of ways, but the issues are more evident, obviously. And there's also the little issue there with the frame rate, which is more noticeable now. I mean, at the time, you probably would have been so wowed by the graphics, you didn't even really care or even know what the frame rate was. But nowadays, you compare it to even its contemporary, or you compare it to even later games in the series, and it's just very choppy in places. Still very playable though, lots of fun, great soundtrack. Even if you don't like the game for whatever reason, it would be almost impossible to say that it's an outright bad game, because it's not in any conceivable way.
Back in the day, I would have said probably a 9. I was right there when it came out, and I was very impressionable at the time, and the graphics blew me away, and you were just doing stuff you couldn't do in normal games at that point. So if I was to rate it nowadays, probably a 7.
Yeah, I'm gonna one up both of you. I'm gonna go for a 10 on contemporary score. I just believe this game is one of the most relevant, most impressive games on the SNES. I think that there's maybe 2 or 3 games on the SNES that are superior. And it also helps that this is an action, very arcadey, fast-paced game, which is completely out of line with a lot of the other really popular SNES titles. So I think that gives it a clear advantage over a lot of them. And it's something that you couldn't get on a Sega system, so it's got that advantage there as well. Modern score, yeah, the frame rate's kind of dodgy. The hitboxes are really frustrating to deal with. The difficulty is kind of a little bit too punishing in places, so I would probably knock it down to about a 7. If it came with the soundtrack as like a bonus extra, maybe an 8. It's got such a nice sound to it. I really like that. Alright, so you know our scores, and I think they're pretty high scores. They might have been the highest that we've averaged out for games here. The question is, would you recommend Star Fox to someone today?
That's a good question, because you already have you have Star Fox 64, which most people would say is their favorite entry in the franchise, and it does usurp this game in a few ways. But yeah, I would say it's worth playing just to see what the big deal was at the time. I mean, it's maybe harder to wrap your head around now, or it's harder to or easier to wrap your head around now. But at the time, it's just mind blowing, and it's good sometimes to go back and play those games that sort of defined the industry at certain points in time, just to get a feel for what the climate was at the time. I mean, you have a game like Star Fox, that was probably the real start of the 3D era in gaming. And then you have games like Quake that came after it that pretty much cemented 3D as, the next thing in video games. So yeah, just play it, even if it's just as a technical curiosity rather than as a game.
I'd definitely recommend it to someone to play if they're interested in how the series evolved, or...
So you'd say it's worth playing, Doc?
Yeah,
just to see the evolution of the series?
To see the evolution and the differences between Star Fox and Star Fox 64.
Because I think the most interesting difference between the two, Star Fox does not have the lock-on ability that was introduced in Star Fox 2 and then actually saw release in Star Fox 64.
Right.
So it plays almost, it's almost like it plays differently, but with a very similar concept and execution. So there's a little, kind of some subtle differences that make the games worth playing, even if you've already played one of them. Especially if you've already played 64. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't give the SNES game a try. I would almost surely recommend playing the Star Fox 64 first, and if you find that you want more Star Fox, go back and play the SNES one, because it's gonna probably fill roughly the same void. If I really wish there was a way that you could play just a couple of the planet stages, because I think those are the highlights of the game, and those are a little bit tougher to get to, because you have to go through the harder levels to get to some of the cooler planets. Like, if there was a way, I would just say, if you can play Fortuna, give Fortuna a shot, and that would be great. And if you like that, you might like the rest of the game. So it's a cautious recommendation. You got Corneria, play Corneria, and maybe play more of it if you like it.
If you've had your fill of Star Fox after 64, definitely don't go forward in the series. It'll only end in tears.
Yeah, that's debatable.
I do not like Star Fox Command. It's like Star Fox 2 if it was released and it was terrible.
Yeah, Command, there are a lot of people in the community who do not like Command. mostly because of the story. I haven't played it myself because
I
money.
didn't enjoy the gameplay either. Well, on that note, Star Fox 64 was remade on the 3DS. Have you played that one, Doc?
I have not played it yet because I refuse to spend $30 on a game that I've played before for like $10 on the virtual console, even if it is just a prettier coat, so...
Do you know if anyone would recommend that one? Like, if we were gonna recommend a Star Fox to someone, would you say if they've got a 3DS that would be the one to get, or do you think they should play
Yeah,
it on
that would
virtual
probably be
console?
the one to get.
Well, I'd say this course is clear. Thanks to everyone who's listening in, and a special thanks to our guest wingman, Dr. Allosaurus. Don't forget to subscribe. Hit us up in the comments if you like what we're doing. And you can follow us on Twitter. Snabu doesn't have a Twitter, since regrettably, I had to burn his house to the ground. Please do a tent. He needs a tent.
How about a box?
And if you're still here, why not watch a couple of our previous retrospectives by clicking those images or something? And if you'd like to play a guessing game, next month's game was released in 1995 and is positively oozing with character. Hope to see you then.
Does anyone want some macaroni? We gotta make some macaroni.
I want
You guys can
macaroni.
have some macaroni, but you have to come and get it.
Oh
Or I
man,
can
I don't...
send it to you via parcel post. I'll put some macaroni in a container, and then I'll send the macaroni in the post.
Oh, then it'll be leftover macaroni. And leftover macaroni's no good, man.
Well, you don't microwave it. You heat it back up in like a saucepan. You know,
Mm.
you put, because it's got lots of sauce, you just put it in the saucepan. Set it to like, low heat, if you've got a dial, a 2 or whatever, around
Right.
there. And just let it just warm itself up over 15, 20 minutes, and stir it a little bit to get the cheese nice and soft. That should work pretty well.